In 1985, Gary Gygax wrote an article in Dragon magazine discussing his ideas of what might constitute a revision or a second edition of the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons game. However, by the time the article was actually published, Gary had been removed as the president and CEO of TSR, and he would leave the company 3 years before the publication of second edition Dungeons and Dragons without having any further creative contributions to the direction of the game. We're going to talk about what Gary's version of second edition Dungeons and Dragons might have been today on Daddy Rolled a One. Please help support More Daddy Rolled a One by buying a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, poster, notebook, or other items from my shop. Thank you. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons and Dragons, and one of the companies that published them, Tactical Studies Rules, and one of its later descendant companies, TSR Hobbies. Today, I'm going to be talking about what a second edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons may have looked like had Gary Gygax stayed with the company at TSR. He began talking about a possible revision to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons as early as 1985, and he began to outline what he thought might be contained in such an edition, but he was unfortunately no longer at TSR, the publisher of the game, by the time that this game was written and created and eventually published. So that's going to be the focus of today's video. I have started a little discussion on this before and sort of a part one of this two-part series, if you will. In the first part, Gary began to talk about what he was calling at the time an expansion of the game, and particularly focusing on what types of character classes might be added in a game. So I talked about that in the last video. I'm going to put a link up here for you in the should be upper right-hand corner for you. But you may be wondering if you're new to the game. So if you only started playing Dungeons and Dragons, say during the 5th edition era, as an example, you might not know who Gary Gygax is. I know most of my viewers do, but why are we talking about him? Well, because he is the person that basically wrote and created the core of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which is what we now call first edition. And then, of course, he was a co-creator for the original version of the game with Dave Arneson. And so that's why I'm talking about him. But speaking of Dave Arneson, I do also want to point out that I will be going to DaveCon at the end of this week, actually. So today is the 22nd and 23rd of April. I'm recording this over 2 different days. And I will be heading to Minneapolis for DaveCon for this weekend, the 26th through the 28th. So if you are going to DaveCon, which is honoring not only Dave Arneson, but also Dave McGarry and Dave Wesley, please look me up when you're there. I will be wearing merchandise like shirts and a hoodie from my shop. So I hopefully will be pretty easy to recognize, and just feel free to come up and say hi. All right. So let's talk about what are these changes that Gary Gygax was talking about for a second edition? And also, why is this important? Why are we talking about this at all? Well, as we all know, we're now on the so-called, 5th edition. There is a new edition that's coming out later this year, 2024, in celebration of the 50th anniversary of Dungeons and Dragons. And the game has evolved over time. And it's fun and interesting, and I think also educational, to look at what are the changes that have been made across these editions. Now, I'm going to be focusing more on what Gary's version of a second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons game would have been, and then, again, talking a little bit about what did we actually get. But I'm not going to be diving into the core of the mechanics of second edition. I know most of my viewers with these history videos are more interested in the earlier editions. And to be quite blunt, I never really played second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So I kind of switched over the game. I moved, and then the game group that I found, they were playing Warhammer Fantasy Battle. So I bought most of the books for second edition, and I worked on a campaign setting for second edition with the intent of running a game, and that I never really played it all that much. And then eventually I just moved into third. So just wanted to give you that background really quick. I know that there are a lot of people, however, that really do like second edition. I kind of just looked at these two games as being kind of compatible and mixing and matching. All right, but let's talk about what Gary was talking about. So this is Dragon Magazine number 103. And there's an article in here
by Gary Gygax from his column from the Sorcerer's Scroll. You can see he's now copywriting his writing. And he talks about what the second edition books will be like. So this is published in November of 1985. It's kind of interesting because there's a lot of stuff going on at TSR in this time period. So what's happened, just because we need to understand the state of the company and Gary writing this article and the timing of this article, because it is, I'll say it's kind of an unfortunate timing. So what's happened is, of course, the game has been published, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, and by 1985, it is on its 6th book, which is going to be this one. So the Monster Manual 2 by Gary Gygax is published in 1983. However, he started working on it before that, of course. So it's a big undertaking. But this is the 6th book published in the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons line. Also in 1983, you're going to get a revision of the cover art and the trade dress of the entire core line of books, with the exception of the Fiend Folio. So this one never gets a new trade dress, and it's the kind of the outlier. So as you move into 1983 and then beyond, through the last published book in the AD&D line, which is Greyhawk Adventures in 1988, they're all going to have these, or 1988, pardon me, they're all going to have these orange spines, the similar typeface, official Dungeons and Dragons, all that kind of stuff. This is the only one that doesn't get that treatment. Okay, so that's 1983. Now, 1984, TSR does not publish any new hardback books for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. During that time, Gary Gygax is out on the West Coast, forming a new division, TSR Entertainment. It's later going to be renamed as D&D Entertainment. But the intent of that company is for Gary to make connections to get a D&D movie made. That never happens. He does make some connections, but the movie never comes to fruition. So they got as far as, I believe that there is a script for that, if I remember correctly. That was never produced. And as I understand, they actually got Orson Welles attached to the project. So it was kind of moving along. But the big thing that comes out of Gary's time on the West Coast is the creation of the D&D cartoon. Now, 1985, Gary, according to Gary, gets word that TSR is not doing well, and it was in financial difficulties. So they were the number one role-playing game company. They had a revenue of $30 million. So that was, at that time, amazing for this industry and a company like that. However, they were $1.5 million in debt. And this is mostly due to, as Gary says, mismanagement by the company. I'm not going to get too into the weeds on this. There's whole books that you can read on this, John Peterson's books, Jon Peterson. And he also talks about it on his blog. And those are kind of like some of the core resources for things like this. But essentially, Gary says that there was too much staff, for one thing, more staff than was needed. There were things like extravagant purchases or excessive purchases, such as a lot of company cars that weren't needed. And then frivolous expenditures like they dredged up an old sunken ship out of a lake for really no reason whatsoever, other than to just say that they did it. So Gary comes in, he gets himself put into the position to be the president and chairman of the board of the company, and he immediately publishes Unearthed Arcana, which is essentially a collection of articles that Gary had already written in Dragon Magazine, and they're published pretty much as is with almost no editing. Now, while Gary's name is on this book, this is a group effort, so it's put out really fast, but Kim Mohan does the editing, and there's some other work in here that is done by some other folks. But essentially, it's labeled as being a Gary Gygax book. Later in 1985, we're going to see the release of this book. I know I talked about this before, but this is just for people who haven't watched the previous videos. Oriental Adventures is going to come out later in the year in 1985, going to be TSR's best-selling book. Now, again, this is credited to Gary Gygax. It says with Dave Cook and Francois Marcella Fraudeval. So, and again, I have mentioned this, but it's pretty common knowledge that this book was really pretty much written almost exclusively by Dave Cook. Later on, There's going to be discussion where, Gary in hindsight and retroactively says that he didn't really like the parts of the book that Dave Cook wrote, which, as I understand, is most of it, but that he did like the parts that Francois Marcel Frodoval wrote. There were some sections that were kind of like more in Francois's realm, I guess, and Gary claims that he liked those better. What's interesting about this, and again, we have briefly touched on this before, but non-weapon proficiencies are introduced in this book, which is the first time you have essentially what we now would call a D&D skill system. And that is going to be something that Dave Cook is going to bring into the second edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So Dave Cook works on this, and it becomes sort of a model for what he thinks would be in a second edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so that's the state that we're in when Gary writes this article. Now, the article is published in November of 1985. However, in October of 1985, Gary is called into a meeting with the board of directors where he has tried to right the ship and move people into certain positions. And one of those people was a woman named Lorraine Williams that was added to the board through some connections that Gary made out on the West Coast with, I just forgot his first name, but his last name is Dille. And I've heard it pronounced Dilly. I always thought it was Dill, but it could be Dilly. But that family, so Lorraine Williams was in that Dilly family, or Dill family, however you want to say. And they had a history of having been involved with Buck Rogers, like an ancestor of theirs. I can't remember if it was her dad or grandfather had created the character of Buck Rogers in the 25th century. So, but anyway, she is brought onto the board of directors at the recommendation of Gary's friend. Sorry, I have to say Mr. Dilly because for whatever reason, I'm just having brain fog and I can't remember what his first name is right now, but that Gary had met him while he was on the West Coast, and that relationship ended up with Lorraine being on the board. Now she's the one that ends up essentially forcing Gary out. He is removed as the president of the company. He's removed as the chairman of the board. And it is specifically stated that he will have no more direction over the creative endeavors of the company from that point forward. He is left on as a member of the board, or as a director, but he essentially is just stripped of all power, as well as from his creative duties. So it takes about a year, but Gary's eventually going to exercise his stock options and do the things that he needs to do to extricate himself out of the company and leave. So what's really awkward about this, again, is this magazine comes out in November, okay, because it takes about 3 months for a publication like this to go to print. So you have to have the layout done. You have to know what articles are going where, what ads are going where, what size of the ads. Is it a color ad or is it black and white? And same with the articles. Are there color plates that need to be printed? And all this layout is being done, a lot of it in a time before, desktop publishing. Now, by the time we get to this time period, there's very rudimentary desktop publishing, but it's still a lot of it is done manually. Okay, so Gary would have written this article and it would have been submitted for publication in this magazine before that meeting happened, but it gets published after that meeting has happened. Now, the general public, the average Joe gamer doesn't know what's going on. You wouldn't have heard about this because Gary was still trying to figure out, I think, if there was any way that he could kind of maintain or retain or regain, I guess regain would be the right word, control of this company. However, he never does. All right, but let's look at what this article says. Okay. The Future of the Game, What the Second Edition Books Will Be Like by Gary Gygax. And then he says, with the release of the recent publications of Unearthed Arcana and now Oriental Adventures, many of the astute readership, blah, blah, blah. Basically, it's like, where's the game going, is what he says. And then he says, a second edition is a major undertaking. There are corrections to be made, parts to be meshed, materials to be deleted or shifted, and new rules and information to be included in such a work. The first question is, when will this undertaking begin? And he says he anticipates working on it mid-1986. And the scope of that will require about 2 to 3 years to complete. But when it's finished, we'll have fewer but thicker tomes for your amusement and edification. And then he says that does not preclude that there could be later supplements and changes. And he says, and also perhaps new additions. And then he even says a third and perhaps even a fourth someday. So he's looking ahead and understanding that this game is going to keep evolving. Okay, probably not evolving the way it did, but or at least in his mind, he wouldn't have thought that. Okay, and then he says one day it might attain a point where the rules can be graven in stone, but he thinks that would be a long time in the future. And then he said the first subject that they would deal with is the Monster Manual, which is just interesting because that's exactly what they did with first edition D&D. The Monster Manual came out a year before the Player's Handbook. Okay, so he's talking about that's what's going to happen first. The Monster Manual will be looked at. And they're going to also include the Fiend Folio tome. And the 3 books will be edited for errors and omissions, re-illustrated in part, and color plates added, which will be useful as painting guides, and then certain entries deleted. And then they're going to go through things like the modules and Dragon Magazine and see if there's any other monsters that they can add. Okay, and then he says, Frank Metzner is... Mentzer is desirous of restructuring the order in which the information given. Gary wants to present creatures by region. So he said that by plane, subterranean, or similar categorical means, and that would help work as a reasonable random encounter reference. So that's what he wanted to do. And then he said he'd hoped to have all that accomplished in 1986, but he says, but don't hold me to that. So let's talk about that just really briefly. So what he's considering is, again, taking the 3 monster books, the Monster Manual, the Fiend Folio, the Monster Manual 2, cutting them up, rearranging them, getting rid of some stuff, and keeping certain ones, adding stuff from modules and magazines, and put it into a larger tome. It would have been a monster of a tome. Pardon the pun. I honestly didn't mean that. But it would have been huge. And he talks about adding color plates. Well, the color plates are something that we're going to get. So starting with 2nd edition and onward, we're going to see color art for all of the monster books that we didn't see in 1st edition D&D. So that's one big change that he's predicting is going to happen. That actually does happen, even though he wasn't involved at the time. All right, so let's continue with this article here that Gary writes. And then he says, next, so after the monster books, the Player's Handbook and portions of Unearthed Arcana and Oriental Adventures. So again, this book and the other one that we showed earlier. So he's talking about, basically, they've just been published, but he's already talking about, taking portions of them and putting them into the main books for the game. So he says the information needed to be a player of the game should be contained between the covers of one book, and we will do so. So that's an interesting thing for him to say, because you wonder, why would he say that? Well, it's because when he wrote Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, he kind of wrote it as he was going along. And so again, we talked about how he wrote the Monster Manual first, then he wrote the Player's Handbook, and then last comes the Dungeon Master's Guide. I have a whole video on the Dungeon Master's Guide of this, and it is one of my favorite books of D&D of all time. It is by far my favorite advanced D&D book. But the organization of the Dungeon Master's Guide is not great. I think most people agree with that. Even if you love that book, it's not really laid out in a kind of a clear manner that makes sense as to why it would be laid out that way. And a lot of the information that is in the Dungeon Master's Guide should be in the hands of players. And a lot of people have made suppositions that part of the way that Gary Gygax wrote the Dungeon Master's Guide was that he was answering questions that had come up from people in the time period since the Player's Handbook had been published, where people had questions about things that weren't addressed there. And so he put them in the Dungeon Master's Guide. But in reality, I guess, had he thought of it, he would have put it in the Player's Handbook. So what I have heard, the story that I've heard, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, is that the way that he decided to figure out how to organize the material for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons was essentially cutting up pages from original Dungeons and Dragons, or even photocopying, then cutting out specific sections, like not whole pages or whatever, and putting them on a bulletin board and figuring out what should go where. And that's not a horrible way to approach it, but I think most people also agree, whether you like Gary or not, most people agree that sort of organization was not really his strong suit. So he's more of a creative person, not necessarily someone who's great at, again, organizing his thoughts and ideas into something that's concise and clear and well edited. But that's kind of what he's talking about here. And I think he realized that. I think Gary knew that was not his strong suit. And so he's discussing how they're going to put all the player information in one book. Now, he's also referring to the fact that if you look at Unearthed Arcana. So and I have talked about this before, but there are two sections to this book. There's the players section, okay, and then in the back here, after the spells, there's a Dungeon Masters section. Well, I have showed this before. Oh, here it is. Okay, so here's the Dungeon Masters section. And so the idea was if you bought this book and you were a player, you would just stop reading at page 73 because this is not for your eyes. And so that's also the other thing Gary's talking about is taking this up front section here and putting it in the player's book. And then this section would go into a revised Dungeon Master's Guide. Okay? So that's what he's talking about. Okay? And then he says, monks as a PC type will certainly be moved to an Oriental-themed campaign section. So that's interesting because it sounds like his intent was to have two different campaign setting types in the revised game. There would be a sort of Western or Occidental, whatever you want to call it, section of campaign, and then there would be an Oriental section of campaign. So it sounds like he's intending to put both of them in the same book as examples of how you could play a Western or Eastern style game, and that he's going to move the monk to the Eastern style. Okay, and then he said assassins will be reduced to optional status and used only as NPCs as your DM decides is best for his or her campaign. And then we'll keep going. Bards will be rewritten to allow a player to start a bard character as a bard, and the current system will be removed. Okay, so how does all that come to pass? Well, the short version is monks are not in the player's handbook. However, there is no campaign setting information in advanced or second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So there's no distinguishing between Western and Eastern style campaigns. So there are no other Eastern style characters in here like, ninja or like Yakuza and stuff like that were in the original Oriental's Adventures handbook. They're not in here. Okay, so monks are just removed completely. And then he says assassins will be moved to optional status. Well, that doesn't occur in here. Assassins are just gone. So there are no assassins in second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And then he said the bard will be changed so that it could be played from the beginning as a bard. Well, that does happen. So we do get a new bard class here. In this case, it's a subclass, and it is it's kind of a subclass. I'll put it that way. But it's rewritten so that you could play it from first level. Okay, so that's your new bard class that happens. So we didn't get the version of second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons that Gary wanted by any stretch of the imagination. However, there is a lot of stuff in here that, 4 years before this is published, he was talking about his ideas. And so some of them do come to pass. Okay, so he talks about that. And then he says, will there be any brand new classes? He says, sure, I hope to get the Mystic completed as a second subclass of Cleric, and likewise the Savant to make a second subclass of Magic User. And finally, the new Bard class would have its own subclass, the Jester. We talked about all of those in that previous video that I referred to earlier on the new classes that he was talking about. But interestingly, the one he doesn't mention here is the Mountebank, which seemed like from his own writings was very popular with people who, when he was discussing the potential new classes, but he doesn't address it in here at all. Okay, and then he says there's bound to be a few other additions to the player's book, and he forgot a medieval weapon, so he talks about that. And then he said anything major will be previewed in this magazine first, unless I don't have time to do it. And then he basically says that means the new classes. You're not going to see the new classes or subclasses in the magazine before they're printed in the final form, because he just doesn't have time. And so he says, now we have a pair of hefty tomes, the second edition Player's Handbook and a second edition Monster Manual. And then what's next? And then he talks about it would be the Dungeon Master's Guide. And so knowing that what the new book for players will be likely to contain gives a good insight into what the DM's book will cover. And he says it's going to include all this information on the planes, which they have talked about here in Dragon Magazine. And then they're going to remove the random encounter materials and the monster XP lists. And then he talks about psionics. And he says a subject I have sidestepped in both commentaries on the expanded new editions. Okay, so basically what he says is I would like to remove it. I'd like to get it out of the fantasy role-playing system and put it into a game where it belongs, something modern or futuristic. He says that's not fixed yet. And he says the way you're going to find out whether Psionics are in the game is when you get the Monster Manual. Because remember, he's intending to publish these not concurrently, but consecutively. So the Monster Manual is going to come out first. And he says if you find creatures in there that have psionics, then you'll know I kept it in the game. But if they're missing, you'll know I've got rid of it. Now, later on, Gary's going to talk about, and I've talked about this before, he was on the message boards on Dragon's Foot and on Eon World, and people could ask him direct questions. And a lot of people asked him, what would he have done in second edition? And so one of the things that he talks about is that he had decided by this point, now again, this is later on, but he's like, psionics would have been gone, just gone. And a lot of people were like, well, what does that mean for something like a mind flayer that relies on psionic powers? And he basically said, I would have rewritten it so that they could have still used those things, but wouldn't have relied on the psionic system that I created. And then he even goes on to say that it wasn't a great system. So the one that he himself created, he goes on to say that like he would change it because that wasn't the ideal system for running psionics. Okay, so he talks about that. So how's that going to play out in second edition? Well, we don't have psionics in here, so they are not part of the game. So that is kind of going along with what Gary was talking about here. Now, here he was kind of questioning, but you can kind of read between the lines in here because he said, frankly, I would like to remove it. So I think he was trying to figure out how he could do that without messing up too much other things. But we do not get psionics in second edition. Now, there is a book that is going to be published later on called the Complete Psionicist's Handbook, or it might be Complete Psionics Handbook. I'll put a cover up here so you can see what it looks like. One of the few complete handbooks that I did not get because I'm not a Psionics fan. It's just not my thing. So I never bought that one back in the day, but they do create a whole optional subsystem for adding psionics back into the game a few years after this is published. So there you go. That's your details on psionics. Okay. And then he says, now what's going to happen? And he talks about Deities and Demigods Cyclopedia, which was recently retitled Legends and Lore by others as a sop or bowing to pressure from those who don't buy our products anyway. And then he said, for those who can't read between the lines, he did not agree that they should approve, or he did not approve of the retitling of the work. So, but that work was done. There were people at the time, the Satanic Panic was a real thing back in the day. There were, news stories on, I think it was 60 Minutes, where they tried to imply that Dungeons and Dragons was a satanic cult entry form. And the people at D&D, the management, kind of wanted to get away from that. And Gary's point, as you see here, was sort of like, those people aren't going to buy our games anyway. So why change something to appease them? But I think the idea was, we don't want people having any kind of excuse as to why they're not playing our games. So change the name. So they changed Deities and Demigods to Legends and Lore. But what he's really talking about in here, and it's very long, it goes on for this whole column here and then continues all the way over here on this next page of the article. But basically what he's saying is he's going to rewrite, or someone is going to rewrite and change Legends and Lore / Deities and Demigods to focus more on how a player plays a cleric and giving them all the information that they would need on the rituals and the colors of the robes and the rites and all that kind of stuff, so that a cleric of one god is different from a cleric of the other god in terms of how they are role played, how they're played in the game. And so that is what most of this section is about. He's talking about how they would do that. And it says, if you consider powers of the planetars and solars stated in the Monster Manual 2, there's no questions the abilities of those who command them. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so, typical Gary, he overtalks everything, but he says the revised L&L tome was give more information regarding clerics and the followers of each deity, and then you'd have a separate DM section that would deal with the minimum powers of each deity, along with a solid list of the standard powers typical for each deity. Spells usable only by such beings should be in there too, and this would all be expanded by the inclusion of new material. So he's talking about a pretty big change to the Deities and Demigods, Legends of Lore book for this, to help players and DMs implement a cleric class and priestly powers and organizations of priests and how they differ by deity in the game. And so then he says, so what you're left with are 4 books: a revised player's handbook, dungeon master's guide, monster manual, and legends and lore. And each would be larger, and then they would contain all the information under the cover of the appropriate tome. And then he says, but I foresee one special difficulty, which is that people reading this magazine are hardcore gamers, and they would buy all 4 books. And he's probably right. But he said it would be a huge drawback because of the expense needed to play this game for someone who's never played before. And so he goes into talking about what if they could make the player's handbook contain all the information on basically generating characters and how to play them, and make it so that it was a smaller book in a 128-page range. And basically it ends up being sort of like your starter book, so that you could have a 1-volume book. A 1-volume edition could be offered for adepts, while those desiring to learn could enter by picking up 1 or 2 smaller books. So he's talking about having smaller books available and dividing the classes up. So, and that's one of the interesting things that I think I get out of this particular thing. He says, character information of a specific nature could then be handled in special works which detailed the 4 basic sorts with subclasses, weapons, armors, spells, and so on. So books dedicated to each individual class and the subclasses and armors and spells and things that they would use could be like perhaps 1 book for each character. Well, we're going to end up getting that in 2nd edition. Now, it's not exactly what Gary was talking about, because he was doing it for a beginner so that they didn't have to buy everything all at once. They could buy it piecemeal and decide what they liked and didn't like, and then they could pick and choose what they were going to purchase in order to play the game. But this idea of having dedicated books detailing specific character classes and everything associated with them is going to be a hallmark of what we're going to get with 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons. Okay, so we'll talk about that in a minute. But he says, basically your advice is appreciated. So, please write in and tell me what you think. So now, again, remember, this article is published after Gary's already been forced out of his position as president and chairman of the board. And basically all his creative power has been stripped from him as far as the direction that the game's going to go. Okay, so that's that article. Now, what's going to happen is about 2 years later, not quite 2, but close, Dragon Magazine number 122. So let me point out something real quick here too. The editor of Dragon Magazine number 103 is Kim Mohan. Okay. Now, Dragon Magazine number 122, we're going to see here that the editor-in-chief is now Roger E. Moore. Okay, and there's an article in here, The Sorcerer's Scroll, A Few Words and Goodbye, from one of the creators. So this is from June of 1987. And here we see Gary publishing this article. Basically, this is his goodbye. And he's saying, many of you probably wondered why you haven't seen or heard anything from me in these exalted pages for a year or so now. And you might notice that my name's been completely absent from the magazine in general. Well, TSR's been generous to allow me to explain, but he says, since October of 1985, I've had no active role in the management of TSR, nor made any contributions to that company's creative efforts. At the time, the board of directors of the corporation saw fit to remove me as the company's president and chairman of the board, although he remained on the board as a director. And he says there was a dispute over stock ownership with various other matters, but in October of 1986, he resigned from all positions in order to form and direct another publishing enterprise. My association with TSR ended absolutely at that time, and since then, I have devoted all of my energies to New Infinities Productions, Inc. In December of 1986, just before the new year, he settled all disputes with TSR, and at that point, there's very clear cut. There's no relationship that he has with the company that he created, and he does mention that it's a company that he created. But from he says, like, there's been a total disassociation, not only from the corporation, but from all the games and other products that he created during his relationship with TSR. So the shape and direction of Dungeons & Dragons game system, for instance, or that of the Advanced game system, are now entirely in the hands of others. And then he said, he talks about he was able to retain rights to the stories of Gord. He just has to thank TSR for allowing him to publish that. But those are like his stories that he wrote about Gord the Rogue in the city of Greyhawk. And then he says, so this is also my last foray into this magazine, which he says seems strange because he's worked on it for so many years, but basically this is it. And then he says that covers the disassociation. He says, well, now let's talk about what's next. And he says he decided to create this new company called New Infinities Productions and head of the company's creative committee. And then he says Frank Mentzer and Kim Mohan have joined as design executives and will also serve as the other two members of the creative committee. And so then he talks about Penny Petticord, who used to work at Polyhedron magazine, and Pamela O'Neill, former assistant editor of Amazing Stories, have also joined the team. And so then he said, Frank, Kim, and I are working together on a broad-based line of materials. And then he talks about, who are the other people that are involved in the company. So that's why Kim Mohan is no longer the editor of this magazine. It's because he left to join Gary at his new company, New Infinities Productions. Now, I just wanted to point that out so that you could see, how long that took. So this is almost 2 years later before he's telling people why he hasn't been doing stuff for Dungeons and Dragons and creating this new company. So a few things there. New Infinities Productions, their first game was called Cyborg Commando, and I'm going to put an ad up here, an advertisement that is eventually going to appear in Dragon Magazine, which is where I heard of it. I was super into cyborgs at the time. I was reading Deathlock comics for Marvel, and I had discovered them in I think it was Astonishing Stories, and I discovered them in a back issue bin in a comic book shop, and I just loved the idea. I loved the $6 Million Man, like all that kind of stuff. So I was super excited, and then I saw this. I don't mean to, say anything bad about the art. I mean, art is subjective, but this just didn't grab me the way that at the time, this is the art that we're getting from TSR is like this kind of stuff. Okay. And then I see this ad for Cyborg Commandos, and it just didn't grab me the same way. So I never checked out that game. It got pretty poor reviews. It didn't sell well. And I think it might be the only product that New Infinities put out before that company is dissolved. So I'm not 100% sure on that. I should have looked that up. But if anybody played Cyborg Commando, I'd love to hear from you in the comments, like what you thought about it, and if you enjoyed it, or not, and why. So the other thing that's interesting and of note in here is that when he talks about Frank Mentzer coming to work with him, so a lot of people said that Dave Cook would not have been Gary Gygax's choice to write this Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition game. So it was pretty well known at this point that Gary was going to need help, that he wasn't going to be able to just sit down and focus and do all this stuff by himself. Had he stayed at TSR, he was in a management position. He would have been running the company and probably wouldn't have found the time to do as much writing. He probably would have given more creative direction and then had others kind of write the game for him based on his thoughts and ideas. And later on, again, retroactively, Gary basically said that the person he would have chosen to do that was Frank Mentzer. Now, that makes a lot of sense because Frank does write what we now call BECMI version of D&D, an introductory version, especially the basic set, the red box, that a lot of people grew up, like that is their version of D&D. Like mine's Moldvay, but there's a huge contingent out there that started 2 years later with the Frank Mentzer version of the basic set. And so, and that set was very well received. It's been said many times that basic set specifically is one of the best examples of teaching people how to play Dungeons and Dragons or a role-playing game in general. So having Frank do that, Gary and Frank had a very good relationship. So it makes sense. And I think that's probably what would have happened. And Frank would have most likely carried out a lot of the direction that Gary gave him. But that's not what happened. Okay. So I just wanted to point that out. That it's interesting that Frank went to work with Gary at his new company. Okay, so that's what we have from what Gary wrote in those two articles. Now, what are some other things that Gary talked about as far as like what did he want to put in the game? So we've talked about the character classes before where, again, what was going to happen with assassins and things like that. We talked about bards. We talked about the monk. Okay. And then he talked about including these new character classes like the Mystic, the Savant, and the Jester. However, later on, again, in sort of like post timing where people are asking him questions, there's a discussion that comes up about magic. And he says that he would have started to create schools of magic and have specialists for them, kind of like the illusionist that we got in the first edition D&D was a specialist in illusion magic. And Gary says he was working on that. He was working on schools of magic, which is something that we get in this version of the game. We get schools of magic with dedicated casters for each school, which is now a legacy part of the game, you could call it, because every edition has that at this point. Gary specifically points out the elementalist as a specialist type thing that he was working on. And then interestingly, he also mentions having a sorcerer class. So if you started playing D&D in the third edition or post phase, sorcerer's just a class, but you might not be aware that it wasn't always one of the original classes. So originally spellcasters of the arcane magic were called magic users. There was no sorcerer. You had to have your spell book, and that's how you cast spells. So the third edition sorcerer, which is now, part of fifth edition as well, this idea of having these innate spell casting abilities, that's a later edition that came in the post TSR era. However, Gary mentions having a sorcerer class, but it's not sorcerer the way we think of it. He was talking about a sorcerer class that was essentially something that would summon demons and devils. It's a summoner class called a sorcerer. And then he uses some odd language here, but he basically says they have no magical ability, either learned or innate. They don't have that. So he was working on this class. He does point to some later writings that he did for another game. Now, last time we talked about his game, Dangerous Journeys. He did work on another role-playing game called Legendary Adventures. It's legendary with a J instead of a G. And that game is not a class and level system, but he talks about there are some magical orders in there. And there was one that he points to that's about demon summoning. And he basically said you could look at that as being sort of the direction I was looking at taking this new sorcerer class. So he's talking about a whole new class. And he says the elementalist would have been a subclass of magic user, but the sorcerer would have been a standalone class. Okay, so that's something he talks about. He talks about skills. So Gary pretty vocally did not like the non-weapon proficiencies that were created for Oriental Adventures. Now, as you know from before and some other things that we've talked about on the channel, the non-weapon proficiency system in first edition Dungeons & Dragons is kind of blown out in the Dungeoneer's Survival Guide and the Wilderness Survival Guide. And then it is put into this game pretty much as it was created in first edition, but as an option. So Dave Cook mentions that he's going to use it as an option in here, but most people used it, and it ends up kind of becoming core to the game, even though he said that it's optional. Sort of like how feats in fifth edition are optional, but everybody seems to forget that and thinks that it's a core part of the game and that demand having it. But so he talks about skills, but where he says you could look at his example of what a skill system would have looked like is a publication that he wrote for Troll Lord Games around, I think it was 2006. And this is for Castle Zagig. I'm going to say Zagig. I don't know, it could be Zagig, but it's basically playing on of his last name. But this is his version of Castle Greyhawk, which he no longer owned the rights to, his original Greyhawk, or at least the name rights of Greyhawk, because, TSR owned those after he left. And then when Wizards bought TSR, they acquired the name rights to Greyhawk. So Gary was working on his version of what his original Castle Greyhawk was, but it was called Castle Zagig. And he writes this 10-page little pamphlet size thing. Pamphlet's not the right word, but just a 10-page short publication on class options and skills. And in this publication, he talks about how you pay for skills with experience points. So that's how you acquire them. And then basically when you have that skill, it adds a bonus to your ability score check to perform a certain thing. So it's, in Gary's mind, the skills are still based on an ability check, just like non-weapon proficiencies are, but you're paying for them with experience points. He has a much shorter list of skills, but he has things like ambush and artistic ability and bullying and nautical ability and woodlands ability, things like that. So it's a very tight, very limited skill system. He calls them secondary skills, but he, in his mind, that was where he would have taken a skill system. So we have that to look at as an example or a model of what he might have included in his version of a second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. He goes on to say that he would have cut out the weapon speed factors and the weapon versus AC tables, which, he says nobody really used. Well, he doesn't say nobody used them, but that's the implication, is that he wasn't using them himself and that he would have got rid of them because they just added too much complication to the game. So those tables, yeah. So here's your speed factor and then your armor class adjustment for all of these weapons. Very clunky, cumbersome rules that require you to refer to yet another table during combat. Just when you want things to speed up and go faster, you'd be slowing down to look up your weapon and see, basically the speed factor affected which weapon could be used before another weapon, regardless of what the initiative was. And then you have your armor class adjustment. And this is also very clunky wording because the intent of this is that it's against a type of armor, not the actual armor class. So type of armor meaning chainmail or padded or leather or plate mail. Certain weapons get bonuses or penalties against certain types of armor, but he calls it armor class, which is very confusing. So anyway, he was saying, I would get rid of all that. We already talked about him saying he would get rid of psionics. So he is talking about things that he would remove out of the game. So he's not opposed to doing that, even though Gary does have, just to be honest, a pretty big ego. He's very proud of himself, full of himself a little bit. And I'm not saying that in a bad way. He should be. He created something that, millions of people love and still love, decades after his death. And decades and decades and decades after he created it. So I think he had a right to be proud of what he had done. But he wasn't too proud to say that there are things that he created that in, hindsight, he would take out in a revised second edition. And so those are some of the things that he talked about as far as, where this second edition was going. So 3 other things that Gary did talk about later on that would have been part of his revised second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So I mentioned earlier how he said he would take the monk out and put it in a section for like Eastern campaigns. He wanted to replace that with a cleric type, what he called a warrior spy class that would sort of replace the monk in a Western or Occidental type setting. But he was doing that specifically for his campaign World of Greyhawk because Greyhawk has this group called the Scarlet Brotherhood. And the Scarlet Brotherhood is mostly formed of monks and assassins is really what they are. And so removing the monk class would have sort of messed that up a little bit. And so Gary wanted to replace that concept with, again, what he was calling a warrior spy. So out of everything that he's mentioned as far as like new classes and stuff, I mean, it's a one-liner thing. He mentions it again. This is way later on. It's retroactively after people are asking him questions on message boards in the early 2000s, a little while before he passed away. And but he mentions this warrior spy, and I think that would have been interesting. That would have been cool to look at and see what that would have looked like. Okay, so he talks about that. He also talks about he would have revamped monster hit dice. And the short version of this, he gets into some details that I'm not going to go over. It gets pretty complicated, or not complicated. It's just detailed. But basically what he says is once you introduce the barbarian with D12 hit dice in Unearthed Arcana, at the time it was the only class that had D12 hit dice. And so he said, once you do that he sort of realized like he needed to change hit dice for monsters. And because when first edition Dungeons and Dragons was published, all monsters used D8 hit dice. And so you would see things like certain creatures, Kobold might be an example. I that sticks with me off the top of my head, but I don't have my book out in front of me. But like, I think they had a half hit die, which just means you rolled a D8 and divide it in 2, right? So smaller creatures had that kind of hit dice, like it would go down just by a percentage or a fraction, right? And then larger creatures would just have like, 5D8 or, they have 5 hit dice or 10 hit or whatever. And basically Gary says he would have changed it so that certain more powerful creatures used a higher die type for their hit dice. So D10s and D12s. And then similarly, smaller creatures or more frail creatures would use lower die types like 6 or 4. So it wouldn't have been a hit dice of an 8 standard, wouldn't have worked anymore for him, because he wanted to kind of keep up with the way that player character classes change their hit die. The reason that monsters all have the same hit die is because originally in the game, every class had a D6 for their hit die. So that was why monsters also had at the time, D6s, later was changed to D8 as the standard. But as Gary began playing with all these different character classes and they started getting different hit die types, he didn't change the monsters, but he's saying later on that, yes, he would have done that. And then the last thing he talks about is that because he was envisioning now the monster book would have been very large because there were so many monsters in it, combining monsters from 3 different books, plus supplements from modules and Dragon Magazine, just to name a few. I mean, there's also some monsters and deities and demigods, actually. So those could have been part of this. So he basically says that he would have envisioned the monster manual as being sort of like 2 tomes, one A through L and one N through Z. Now that doesn't happen, but what you do get with 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is what was called the Monstrous Compendium. So it's the only version of the game post 1st edition where the monster book that was released with the core books was not called the Monster Manual. It was called the Monstrous Compendium, and it was a 3-ring binder. And obviously all the pages were 3-hole punched, but it was laid out in such a way that each monster was on its own page, or sometimes it would be like 2 facing pages, but it was designed very specifically that way so that you could buy packs of new monsters, and they mostly did it for like campaign settings. So they would have monsters for Dragonlance or monsters for the Forgotten Realms or Spelljammer or what have you, Ravenloft. And they were 3-hole punched, and but you could alphabetize them how you wanted within your 3-ring binder and move things around, or you could take out the pages that you weren't going to be using for a session and only bring the ones that you wanted to and things like that. I never got that one. For the longest time, this is the only 2nd edition core book that I had until this book came out. So this is later, but this is the Monstrous Manual, and it basically took the fan favorites of all the previous published Monstrous Compendia stuff and just picked the ones that like people were more likely to use, and then put them in here. And I picked this up on a whim, based almost purely just on the art. So I loved. This is Tony Di and I really, really like his art. He's the guy that did the art for Planescape. If you're familiar with that, he's the one that gave Planescape the look that it has. But his, he does all that, like the humanoid style creatures in here. And I'm just such a fan. So I picked this up based on the art, but also you can see each monster's on its own spread, so that, you could alphabetize this or take it out if you're not using the hook horn. It's not going to hurt anything. So this was a unique thing at the time to have each monster, so there's no page spillage. You're not going over to read about a creature. The layout does it so that it's all on one page. So this is exactly what the layout for the Monstrous Compendium would have looked like. It's just that, it would have been 3-hole punched. Okay. So, but you did see, you're getting your color plates in here that Gary talked about as far as like something that he wanted for the Monster Manual so that you could use them as painting guides for your miniatures. Okay, so that's what Gary's talking about. Again, his version of what we would have seen in 2nd edition. So just really briefly, I want to talk about what ends up happening. So, of course, Gary leaves TSR and they start working on the 2nd edition. Now, in 1985, Gary said it would take 2 or 3 years. So, be released in 87 or maybe 88. Well, this is released in 1989. Now, I assume part of that delay was due to Gary leaving and them having to figure out who was going to work on this and who was going to end up being the lead designer. But it does end up being Dave Zeb Cook. So he writes this article. It says, possibly the most horrifying column we've ever run. Okay, so we still have Roger Moore as our editor here. This is Dragon Magazine number 118. Okay, so this is from February of 1987. So this is actually before the article that Gary writes, basically where he says that, he's no longer with the company. So it would have been very confusing, I think, to people wondering, why is Dave Cook writing about what's going to be in a revised, D&D game when Gary's still there, because the fact is he wasn't there. But basically, Dave writes this column and says, who dies? This was a very famous article. And he basically talks about what character classes are they going to get rid of. So again, I'm not going to go too far in detail on this, but basically what he says is that you've got economics and you have space. And he says you have too much material for a player's handbook if you want to include all the classes that have ever been published. And so he basically says right out the gate, he's going to get rid of all of the Oriental Adventures classes, and that includes the monk. So as we saw that already, that's what we're going to see. And then, so he says, you just can't have that. That would be in its own separate book. So if you want to play a monk, you need to get the Oriental Adventures handbook. He doesn't talk about making a revised Oriental Adventures book. He just says that's what you need if you want to play Oriental themed, Asian, Eastern themed characters. And then he says, but that still leaves about 150 pages of material. Is it still too much? So just think about that. He's saying that 150 page rulebook for players is too much. Think about how big the rule books are now. But he's trying to keep it to 128 pages, which is just not realistic. But it is and it isn't. I'll put it that way. It's very easy to write a game that wouldn't be 128 pages, but that's not what AD&D is. AD&D needs all these rules. That's part of how the game is structured. But he just says, well, let's talk about what we're going to keep. And so he basically says he'd keep the big four, except, just some interesting things here. He says playing a fighter is boring, but it has to stay in there. He says clerics, he says nobody plays clerics correctly. So he even talks about there's a fact that you could get rid of them. And then you could come out with a complete book later on that details the cleric, but not have them be part of the core rules. That's not what they end up doing. They leave the cleric in the game, but he was talking about the idea that you could get rid of the cleric. And then he talks about the idea of having clerics be different based on what god they worship. So that he said, if you did this, you could actually tell the difference between a cleric of Thor and a cleric of what's his name. So that's something that Gary was kind of dealing with when he was talking about those revisions that he would have made to Legends and Lore or Deities and Demigods. They just take it, a little bit farther here. And that's what ends up happening in this edition. So this is the first edition of the game we're going to get where the official cleric isn't limited to just blunt weapons, depending on who the god is, what god they worship. Okay. And so that's part of this. And then he talks about the magic user. He's going to leave it because it's just part of the game. And then he says the thief has people that complain, but it's not bad. It's just that it's not written well. And so he talks about it just needs to be fixed so that it's more playable. Okay. So, and then he says, like clerics, these are likely to have small changes made to give the player more choices and subtle advantage. Chief of these may be moving all his thieving abilities to the proficiency system, the non-weapon proficiency. So remember, at this point in the game, you have different systems for different types of characters. So clerics turn undead on a 2d6 table. Other characters have what we call the X and 6 chance to detect things like secret doors or to hear noise or to detect sloping passages. That's, roll a 1 or a 1 or a 2 on a d6 to succeed. And then thieves have the hear noise, which is based on an X and 6, but they also have percentage skills that they're rolling for other things that they have, other thief abilities like moving silently and hiding in shadows. Those are based on percentage dice. And so what he's talking about here is, well, you could change the thief skills to be based on the non-weapon proficiency system so that they all use the same mechanic. And in that is essentially an ability score roll under your ability on a d20, and then you're adding a bonus based on whether you have the skill or not, or you're taking a penalty if you don't have it. And then also based on like the referee, what the referee says is the applicable bonus or penalty at the time. So if that sounds familiar, that's because in 3rd edition, we get rid of all those separate subsystems. I say the game, Wizards of the Coast, changed the game of Dungeons & Dragons to remove all of the unique individual subsystems by class or by character or by race and move it all to that D20 roll high versus a target number. But before that edition, these weren't like that. Every class kind of had its own thing going on. Okay, so he talks about the thief, and then he gets into the subclasses, which I think are interesting. So he says the assassin's gone. Nothing you can say is going to save it. I'm not keeping it. The monk was heavily revised. It's not going to be in the core books. And then he says the bard just doesn't work. He says there's a chance that you could change it. but it doesn't work as is. If you remember, if you've seen my video on the Bard, the original first edition Bards had to start out as fighters, then they became thieves, then they became druids, and once you became a druid, you were also then a bard. It was a whole hassle, and he's basically saying it doesn't fit the rules, and it's not very playable. But, if you could change it, we'll see what happens. And then he says, Barbarian, Cavalier, Paladin, Ranger all present special problems. Many people have complained that the Barbarian and Cavalier are unbalanced, unplayable, and unnecessary. If you've seen my video on the history of Unearthed Arcana, that's core to people's complaints about that book. And then he says, but others have claimed that they're great and marvelous. He agrees with the first group that they're unbalanced and unplayable. And so he says, I think that we would take them out of the core rules and save them instead for a special book devoted entirely to fighters. So again, remember, Gary had suggested this idea of you might have books dedicated to each class and going into details on that class. And now Cook is picking that up and saying that might be something that we're going to look at doing. And then he talks about paladins, which is a strong archetype, just like the ranger as the valiant woodsman. But then he says, so that makes me want to keep the ranger. But he says many of the ranger's powers are learned skills. And if you had a proficiency system that lets your character learn skills, you could basically create, sorry, that's not focusing. You could create a normal fighter and change it into a ranger by picking the correct skills. There we go. Gosh, sorry, that took so long. So that's how you could create a ranger. You don't need a separate class. You would just do it with the proficiency system. So that's going to tick a lot of people off. And as you know, we didn't get rid of it. So then he says the illusionist is a little tricky, but it's basically just a magic user with a different spell list, and that we could do that with all the different spells, types of magic, schools of magic. And then he says if you have a strong proficiency system, the thief acrobat would still exist. You just build a thief and then pick the right proficiencies. And then he says there's the druid, which is the hardest one. Some think it's too weak, it's too limited, it's only wilderness adventures. It's very much a Western European character archetype. So he talks about all of that and says, I'm just trying to figure this out. Okay, so he writes that. Then a few issues later, issue number 121, he follows that up and basically gets into the details here of what's going to happen. And he says, nothing was set in stone, but people are basically asking questions. And he said, many of you sound biased and predisposed, are my comments even going to be considered? And he said, yes, absolutely. And then this person says, one of the reasons for how for AD&D's games continuing excellence is how it is continuing expanding into new areas, offering wide variety. So he talks about that and how they understand the game's going to keep expanding. The way to avoid edition 3 is to make allowances for changes. And so he says, yes, we absolutely want to do this, and we want to avoid an edition 3, which of course we know didn't happen. A couple other fun ones that I wanted to point out in here. This person says, in some ways, the inherent fuzziness and contradictions in the game are what give it its charm. I actually agree with that. I know maybe not a popular opinion with folks, but Zeb Cook agrees with them. He says, yeah, you bet. The fuzziness is what drew me into the AD&D game. I wound up being a designer, and it makes it fun. And I think sometimes people overlook that because they're looking for this slick, streamlined system that handles everything the exact same way. And there's an elegance to that, and I do appreciate that. But one of the reasons why I've gone back to running the 1981 Moldvay basic Dungeons & Dragons game for my daughter and her friends is that fuzziness. I look at it as it doesn't actually try to have a rule for everything, and it allows me as the referee to then make decisions based on my table and my players and what works best for us, without making me feel that I'm doing something wrong or that I'm going to break the game because I'm not following this elaborate subsystems of rules. Okay, so I thought that was interesting. And then this person says, I propose that you write the new player's book in a bare bones fashion. And he says, I agree, but what does that mean? What's bare bones to you might not be bare bones to me. What's bare bones? What's fat? All that kind of stuff. And so he said, currently our bare bones is in the middle ground. We have to create a rule set that satisfies you without terrifying those who want to learn the game. And he says, let them eat basic. You say it doesn't work that way. I don't know why it doesn't work that way, but he says it doesn't. I understand they're two separate lines, but I think they could have maybe done a better job of explaining that you could use the basic set to learn how to play. And anyway, this person then says, we have spent a lot of time and money on the game. After buying the present books, I do not relish the thought of buying them all over again. And of course, that's a complaint that someone would have, and it's very valid, and it's something that people have complained about every time the editions have changed. So it's quite frankly one of the reasons why I think that Pathfinder First Edition was so successful after Wizards of the Coast changed D&D from 3.5 to 4E. So there were people that had been playing, 3E and 3.5, and they had invested so much money in it. You had a lot of people returning to the hobby after that time that had a lot of discretionary income, and you had a lot of third-party publishers publishing stuff, and none of it was usable with 4E. And so I think there was a huge part of players that moved to Pathfinder 1E because it was basically a revision of 3.5, and it was very compatible with all of your 3.5 stuff. So I think that was one of the reasons why, and it's a valid complaint. If you've spent all this money on something, you don't want to chuck it all out the door because it's not compatible with the new edition. And then this person says, the first and most pressing comment I have to make is that the revised game remained 100% compatible with the old. So again, I think that a common complaint that you're going to see every time there's an edition change. And so just letting people know, like, this is nothing new to be fearful of, like, what the changes are going to bring. Okay. And then this person says, I will refuse to buy any second edition books if your plan is to change everything around so it's based on proficiencies. Because Dave Cook was talking about that. He was talking about, well, the ranger is really just a fighter with the right proficiencies, and the thief acrobat is just a thief with the right proficiencies. And so this person's saying, like, I don't want that, because basically D&D sets the standard of class and level systems because it's the first role-playing game that's published and commercially available. But very quickly, you have games like Traveler just 3 years later that are based on a skill system. There are no classes in Traveler, and many other games come out that are skill based. And so it sounds like he might have been saying that was the direction he was going, but then he assures you that no, that is not. I don't want to see, or this person says, I do not want to see the AD&D game become a clone of one of these systems that start from scratch building a character with basically a building block set of proficiencies. And so you could tell people were concerned about that because you have two letters that are basically saying the same thing. And then Dave Cook says, like, no, that's not what he meant. And he's not intending to do that. And we don't get that. Okay. So that's basically what he's talking about doing in here. And so then what we get in this is basically, it's honestly not that different from what he was talking about in these two articles here. So it removes the assassin, it removes the monk, it changes the bard to a class that is playable from first level. Now, all of that was pretty consistent with what Gary Gygax was doing. It includes the non-weapon proficiency system that debuts in Unearthed Arcane, in Oriental Adventures, and then is carried through to the two survival guides. So that system is basically repeated here. It's a little cleaned up, but that's basically in here. I told you as options, it's optional. And it also talks about, maybe you want to use secondary skills instead of proficiencies. I have a whole video on skills in D&D, and so you can hear more about that there because I go a lot more into detail on that. But it gets rid of stuff like we talked about, like the weapon speed factors and the weapon versus armor, and there's no psionics. It's like a lot of stuff that Gary Gygax would have taken out is removed from this. So this doesn't have the same tone of voice as a Gary Gygax writing. It doesn't have that, but in hindsight, looking back, seeing all the things that Gary was talking about that he would have changed, a lot of that does end up in here. It's not the skill system that he would have wanted, but really non-weapon proficiencies aren't that far off in mechanical nature from the way that he envisioned skills in that Castle Zagig product that I talked about, other than Gary said that you should pay for them with experience points. And so that is a difference. But as far as how they are implemented in the game, it's very, very similar. So, and really in reality, back when I was involved, with the game, when we were shifting from first to second, before I ended up moving to Warhammer Fantasy Battle, the people that were around me and the people that I was talking to, they looked at this as something that you would just use with this, as opposed to a complete replacement. It's sort of like, you could play a first edition module with this, and you could play a second edition module with this. And the main thing that's going to happen is the proficiencies could be a problem if you're using proficiencies, but remember, they're optional. So another thing that Gary talked about and Dave Zeb Cook talked about was this idea of books dedicated to each class and like delving into more details for those classes. They both had different design goals for wanting to do that. Gary's was to give people a chance to buy something that was less expensive and not get everything all at once, but sort of pick and choose. Dave Cook's version was you could take a lot of stuff out of the core rules of here and put it in a supplementary book. So what he does go on to talk about later in this particular article is the barbarian and the cavalier. And he essentially says, what is a barbarian and a cavalier other than a fighter with an attitude and a social hierarchy structure that they follow? And so I get what he's saying, but he's basically saying like, you don't need those two classes because you can easily just play them as a fighter and then role play. And so that's what ends up happening. And then you get this series of books. There were dozens of these. Maybe not dozen and a half, but there were a lot. These books, wizards, thieves, priests, fighters, and they all basically offer all these different options. Now, one of the things that these books debut is this idea called character kits. And I've talked about these very, very briefly before on the channel, but essentially a kit is not like a robust subclass, but it's essentially something that's going to give you some role-playing hooks, and then it'll give you maybe like a minor mechanical change to your character to gain a certain benefit in a specific situation, and then it will usually give you a minor hindrance to balance that, and then again, it's going to give you all these role-playing hooks. So what we get in here are the Amazon. You get the barbarian. So this is how the barbarian first debuts in second edition as a kit to a fighter. And it basically talks about what's the description, the role, the secondary skills if you're using that system, the weapon proficiencies, the non-weapon proficiencies if you're using that system, the equipment that they would normally carry, and then what are your special benefits. And in this particular case, this is how they defined the barbarian. It says barbarians are impressive because of sheer strength, intensity, and animal magnetism to give them a +3 reaction bonus in certain situations. Okay, and then the hindrance is that they're going to get a reaction penalty in other situations. And then their wealth and like what races can be barbarians. So that's how they create the barbarian in here. There's a berserker, which really is closer to what we think of being a barbarian now. This is closer. This barbarian is more of a cultural thing. This one has actual mechanical things in it that like change how you would play the character. Okay, gives you sort of like a rage type thing. But here's your cavalier. So in this book or second edition, the cavalier initially is a kit for fighters. Now, a lot of people said they think that kits sort of are presaging what ends up being prestige classes in third edition. I've never understood that argument because prestige classes are much more robust. They're much more fully developed. You can only take them higher levels. You have to qualify for them. And then they give you abilities that are far and beyond what you get in a kit in here. I think kits really are more akin to 5th edition backgrounds, but even backgrounds are more blown out. But that's really what these are. And you get some, again, so you get one for each of these. There's also one for bards. There's one for rangers. There's one for paladins. There's one for druids. There's one for, what am I missing? There isn't one for illusionists. There's a dungeon master's one that's created for necromancers, so you could use that for a bad guy. There's all the different races. So dwarves get one, elves get one, gnomes and halflings are combined. Then there's a humanoids book that covers also half-orcs, which are not part of this version of the game. That's the main, it's the only race that's taken out of first edition D&D and is not in this book. It's the half-orc. And then later on, you're going to get books like this. Well, I talked about the Psionics one already. There's also going to be one for barbarians where they actually end up creating a whole new class, a core class or standalone class of a barbarian. There's also a barbarian cleric in that book, and it also has its own kits for those classes. There's also one for ninja, because again, ninja were popular at the time. And I might be missing a few. I mean, there was like a Spacefarers one. There were campaign setting specific ones, but as far as the general Brown books, I think that's it. So that's a quick look at how we got from Gary's discussion of what he wanted for a second edition to the actual second edition. If you want more information on second edition, if this is an edition that interests you and you don't know about it, you want to learn more, leave me a comment and let me know. I know I just covered it very briefly because my intent wasn't to go over all the mechanical changes, but more just kind of talk about what was or wasn't adopted from what Gary mentioned that he wanted in the game. So that's going to wrap up this look at our, the road to second edition or whatever you want to call it. From this, second of the 2-part video series. So I really hope that you enjoyed it. And if you did, if you could just leave me a comment and let me know. And also, do the standard like, subscribe, and share. That really helps out the channel. And make sure to visit my blog where you can get content that I'm giving away for free. It's mostly system neutral, but when there are mechanics, it's usually designed for basic D&D, but then you can adapt that for any old school adventure game. So with that all being said, I'd like to thank you very much for having watched this whole video. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I will talk to you next time. And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I worked on my notes for this particular video. So drinking wise, I was having some of this. This is BRAULIO. And it is another Italian AMARO. Covered AMARO a little bit on the channel before. And why I was having this one specifically is because recently, just yesterday actually, as part of an event for the Pasadena Education Network, which is a group of staff and parents and involved people in the community that got together to try to help encourage people to attend or have their kids attend Pasadena Public Schools. Anyway, as part of my involvement with that group, I hosted a spirits tasting. And in this particular case, it was an AMARO tasting at their annual wine and spirits event last night. And so every year, I'm just a helper. I'm not really part of the group, but one of my daughter's friends' parents is currently like the chair of the group. And for the past few years, they've asked if I would want to host the spirits tasting, and then they tell me what spirits they want to feature. So the first year I did gin, last year was tequila, and this year they asked me to do Amari. And they left it up to me to pick which ones. And so I picked a local California one, actually, just to have something kind of different, which is not one of my particular favorites, but I knew people would kind of like it, and they did. And then as a complete contrast to that, I picked this one. So this is an Alpine style Amari. And basically what that means is that you're going to get these kind of piney, forest-y, woodsy flavors. There's a little bit of licorice in this one. Nothing like an absinthe or an ouzo, nothing like that. Just a little bit of dried fruit, like dried plum. And like a tiny hint of like menthol, I'd say, on the back. But anyway, so this is, this for me, I would just sip this. So I don't really feel like, some Amari do okay with cocktails. I just feel like this doesn't play well with other spirits. It kind of just wants to be left alone and do its own thing. So I just sip on it, normally after dinner. And that's what I was doing, kind of lingering over my notes after I got home from the tasting from last night. So cheers, chin chin. And it's a digestivo, so something to kind of like settle your stomach after dinner. And then as far as the listening, we are still in the middle or getting toward the end of Jazz Appreciation Month, which is April of every year. So I pulled out this particular one. This is the Quintet, Jazz at Massey Hall. So this is the Quintet because it featured 5 of the most, famous jazz musicians at the time that this is recorded. This is 1953. And so we see here Dizzy Gillespie, usually known as Diz, on trumpet. Bud Powell on piano, Max Roach on drums, Charles Mingus on bass. And then it says featuring Charlie Chan in quotes on alto. So that's Charlie Parker. And he's listed here as Charlie Chan because under his contract with his record label, he was not allowed to be on this label. And so they had to kind of like fake his name because it's a live recording. And so he picked Charlie Chan for a couple of reasons. One is kind of like the fictional detective, but more specifically, his wife's name was Chan. And so he picked that name to go under on this particular album. So this is very classic bebop style jazz of the era. So Diz and Charlie Parker, they'd also call him Bird. And so Diz and Bird performed or kind of like originated or at least made very, very popular the style of jazz called bebop. And that was the dominant form of jazz until Miles Davis and a lot of other people in the late 50s kind of started to shift that style away into more of the more modal stuff. We've talked about that before. So, but this is just a classic album of these giants of the jazz industry appearing at this particular concert. So now a couple things that happened here. So one was that, the musicians actually didn't really get paid, unfortunately. So what was happening is there was a big fight that night with a boxing match with Rocky Marciano and I just forgot the other guy. You can look it up. But basically, it was like the boxing match of the time. And so there was very, very poor attendance at this concert. And so they didn't have enough money to cover for the payment for the musicians. So most of the checks bounced. Charlie Parker was able to cash his, but the rest of the musicians didn't really get paid, at least for a number of years after this. The other thing, very sad, but it's just part of Charlie Parker's life. So he had a very, very aggressive heroin addiction. He died extremely young. And he ends up playing on this album on a Grafton, essentially like an acrylic plastic saxophone, because the story goes, so he pawned his own saxophone right before the start of the concert. And the prevailing theory is that he pawned it to get money to buy heroin. And so he shows up for this performance and he doesn't have a saxophone. And the Grafton saxophone representative happened to be around and asked Charlie if he would play a Grafton plastic saxophone. And so that's what he plays on this particular album. So definitely, it's a classic of the genre of the bebop era of 5 very, very accomplished musicians of this style of jazz. And I would recommend it. So I'm not I don't listen to a lot of bebop, but I love this one just for the energy and because of the talent of all the players on this. So check it out. And I hope you enjoy it. Please check out some of these other videos over here. And once again, just thank you so much for watching. Cheers, and I will talk to you next time.